There are moments in life when the gears in your mind grind to a halt. You're just going through your normal default programming, moving from one thing to the next: podcast recordings, workouts, elk hunting trips, conversations with friends, thinking you've got a grip on what life's about. And then something happens that makes you slam on the mental brakes. The whole machine stops. You're suddenly looking at reality from the outside, like you stepped off the ride for a second. That happened to me one afternoon in a way I never saw coming. I had always been fascinated by different cultures, religions, and ways of thinking, but it was always from the standpoint of an observer. I'd study them the way you study an animal in the wild, interested, even admiring at times, but still separate from it. Then one day, I stumbled into a scene that was so raw, so stripped down, so profoundly human, that it didn't just challenge my understanding of religion, it obliterated my old view of life and death. It started with something as simple as silence, not the kind of silence you get when you put on noise-canceling headphones. I'm talking about a deep, living silence that comes from people collectively directing their entire being towards something beyond themselves. I was visiting a gym where a group of guys had just wrapped up a sparring session. Sweat, laughter, the usual post-training energy. But then, without any big announcement, without even asking anyone to join, a few of them rolled out these small rugs and positioned themselves in a single line, shoulder to shoulder, facing in exact same direction, and then it happened. They started to pray. I had seen Muslims pray before, on TV, in movies, in snippets online, but I had never actually been there in person. This wasn't just bending and bowing, it wasn't chanting, it was unity, physical, mental, spiritual unity. Their movements were synchronized, but it wasn't robotic, it was intentional. Every single motion felt like it carried weight. The way they placed their hands, the way their heads touched the ground, it was like they were saying, "Here I am, stripped of everything, before the one who made me." And in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't performance. Nobody was trying to look holy. Nobody was live, streaming it. These guys were in the middle of their day, with sweat still dripping from their faces. And yet, when the time came, they stopped everything to do this ritual. That shook me. I've spent years talking to the world's greatest thinkers, fighters, scientists, and philosophers. I've heard every argument about consciousness, mortality, and the meaning of life. But what I saw there was something different. It wasn't an argument. It was an embodiment. It was living proof that these men believed in something so much greater than themselves. They would willingly break the flow of their own lives to stand in front of it, 5 times a day, every day. Without fail, it made me think about how most of us live in a constant state of distraction. We're bombarded with notifications, the dopamine drip of social media, the next appointment, the next project. We don't stop unless our body forces us to. And here was a group of people voluntarily stopping the world just to remember. But here's the part that really got me, the way they moved together in perfect harmony. One man's voice would call out a phrase in Arabic and the rest would follow. The kneeling, the bowing, the standing, all of it mirrored like one organism. In that moment, I wasn't looking at a group of individuals. I was looking at a single body with many hearts, all beating for the same reason. I couldn't shake it. Even after they finished, rolled up their rugs, and went back to chatting about training techniques, something had shifted in me. I didn't feel like I had just witnessed something spiritual. I felt like I had been pulled into something spiritual. That night, I went home and did what I always do when something rattles my brain. I started digging. I wanted to understand what I had seen. I read about the 5 daily prayers in Islam, how they're not just a habit, but an obligation. How it's a direct command from God, a structured reminder that no matter how fast life moves, you stop, face Mecca, and acknowledge the Creator. It's like built-in mindfulness, but with the power of submission, and the more I read, the more I realized that this wasn't just about prayer. This was about how you see the world, and more importantly, how you see yourself. In the West, especially in America, we're raised on the idea that you are the center of your own universe. You decide your truth, you chase your goals, you control your destiny, but Islam flips that. It says you're not the center. You didn't create yourself, you're not in control of life and death, you're a servant. And that's not meant to degrade you. It's meant to free you from the illusion that you're in charge of everything. That's a heavy shift. For a guy like me, who's spent his life chasing independence and autonomy, that idea was like a bucket of cold water. But it also made sense. I've seen enough of life from the octagon to the hunting grounds to know that there are forces way bigger than us. You can't muscle your way out of mortality. You can't negotiate with death. And maybe, just maybe, these men had found a way to live that truth every single day. The thing is, once you've seen something like that, you can't unsee it. You can't just go back to your regular program without it popping into your mind. I started noticing the patterns. I'd be on the road for a comedy tour, walking through some random city, and there it was, a man in a shop, quietly locking his door for a few minutes so he could pray in the back. Or a group in an airport, finding a quiet corner, turning toward Mecca, and doing the same synchronized movements I had seen that first day. It was everywhere, and the more I saw it, the more I realized that this wasn't about a single prayer or even a single religion. This was about a complete way of life, something that reorders your priorities from the ground up. Something that says life is not random, death is not the end, there is meaning, and you're part of a story much bigger than yourself. I didn't know it then, but this was the first crack in the armor of my old worldview, and cracks, well, they have a way of spreading. Once that first crack appeared, it didn't just stay in one spot, it spread, slowly, quietly, almost invisibly at first, but it spread. And like any crack in something you thought was solid, it eventually started revealing just how fragile the whole structure really was. See, I'd always had this mental framework about life and death. It was practical, kind of cold, but it made sense to me. Life is finite, so make the most of it. Death is inevitable, so don't dwell on it. That's the kind of mantra you pick up when you're around fighters, soldiers, hunters, people who live with the reality of danger. You respect death, but you don't stare at it too long. But Islam doesn't look at death like that, and that's where it really started to mess with my head. The more I learned, the more I realized that, for Muslims, death isn't just this unfortunate event that cuts the party short. It's not this scary, silent void. It's a transition, a doorway, a checkpoint where you're held accountable for everything you've done, not in a vague, I hope the universe balances things out kind of way, but in a deeply personal, unavoidable meeting with the one who created you. That idea, it hit me like a freight train. I thought about the fights I'd been in, the hunts I'd been on, the close calls I'd had in cars or on motorcycles. I thought about how many times I'd shrugged and said, well, if I go, I go. That was the old framework, death as a distant, abstract inevitability. But Islam was saying, no, you will be questioned, you will stand alone, and you will answer. And that changes everything. Because if that's true, then every moment you live has weight. Every decision, every word, every glance, every thought, it's all part of the record. You can't escape it, you can't spin it, you can't excuse it. That's accountability on a level most of us never even think about. I started seeing it in the way those Muslim friends of mine carried themselves. It wasn't just that they prayed. It was the way they spoke, the way they treated people, the way they held back from certain things even when no one was watching. There was this quiet discipline there, like they were training for the most important fight of their lives, and that fight wasn't in a cage, it wasn't on a battlefield, it wasn't even in this world. It was the fight to leave this life with their soul intact. And here's the thing, I've been around some of the toughest human beings on the planet, men and women who could break you in half without even breathing heavy, but the discipline I saw in these people was on another level. It wasn't fueled by ego or fear of losing a title. It was fueled by a constant awareness that life is temporary and death is inevitable, but what comes after is eternal. I remember lying in bed one night, staring at the ceiling, thinking about that concept of eternity, not just in the poetic, stars will outlive us a kind of way, eternity as in you, your consciousness, your awareness continuing on without end. If you're wired like me, your brain doesn't just let that go. It gnaws at it. It tries to measure something that can't be measured. And when it fails, it either shuts down or it starts asking bigger questions. I didn't shut down. I asked questions. What if we've been looking at this whole thing wrong? What if death isn't the finish line but the start of the real race? What if life isn't about squeezing every drop of pleasure and success out of a few short decades, but about preparing for something infinitely bigger? That was the point where my curiosity stopped being casual and started getting serious. I wasn't just watching Muslims pray anymore. I was reading the Quran. I was looking into the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad. I was listening to scholars break down concepts like the Day of Judgment, the grave, and the soul's journey after death. And here's the thing that blew my mind. These weren't vague, abstract ideas. These were vivid, detailed descriptions of what happens, step by step. It was like going from watching static on an old TV to suddenly getting a crystal, clear broadcast. But along with that clarity came something else, an uncomfortable mirror. I started realizing how much of my own life had been built on the assumption that I was in control. That if I just trained harder, worked smarter, hustled more, I could shape my own destiny. And sure, that's true to a point, but Islam kept throwing this reminder in my face. You didn't create yourself. You don't decide when you die. You're not the ultimate authority here, and you know what. That's both terrifying and freeing. Terrifying because it forces you to confront your own smallness. Freeing because it lifts this insane pressure we all put on ourselves to be our own gods. But man, that terror part it lingered. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, staring into the dark, thinking, what if I'm not ready? What if I've been living the wrong way all along? That's the thing about cracks in your world. Once they open up, the light comes in, but so does the wind. And the wind can be cold. The funny thing is, I didn't even tell anyone what I was going through at first. I kept it internal, partly because I didn't know how to put it into words, and partly because I knew that once I started talking about it, it would make it real. And I wasn't sure I was ready for real yet. But deep down, I could feel it. Something had shifted permanently. Life didn't look the same anymore. Death didn't look the same anymore. And I knew sooner or later I'd have to follow that trail all the way to the end. Once the thoughts started, they didn't stay theoretical for long. That's the thing about ideas that actually touch you at the core. They eventually demand action. You can't just sit around reading about mortality, accountability, and eternity without it bleeding into how you move through the world. At first, it was subtle. I started catching myself in moments I wouldn't have before. I'd be in traffic, ready to lose my mind on the guy who just cut me off, and this little voice in my head would whisper, "Is this really the hill you want to die on? Is this what you want to carry into the next life?" That voice got louder over time. It wasn't guilt in the way I'd been taught to think about it growing up. It wasn't some nagging shame about being bad. It was more like an internal compass slowly reorienting itself. Every small decision, how I talked to people, what I did with my time, what I filled my head with, started to feel heavier. The discipline I had always admired in fighters, in elite military guys, in high-level hunters, suddenly I was seeing that same level of discipline in these Muslims I was learning from. But theirs wasn't about winning a belt, surviving a mission, or landing the perfect shot. It was about living in a way where, if death came for them in the next hour, they'd be ready to meet their Creator without shame. That was humbling, because I realized I had spent years training my body, sharpening my mind, building my career, but I had barely spent any time training my soul. And if Islam was right, if the soul was the thing that actually carries on after you die, then I had been skipping the most important training of all. I started experimenting, not with the full commitment yet, but with small things. I tried fasting once during Ramadan, just to see what it felt like. And let me tell you, I've done every kind of diet. I've pushed my body through some brutal endurance tests. But fasting in that context was different. It wasn't just about willpower, it was about intention. Every hunger pang was like a tiny reminder, you're not just a body. You're a soul, and you're disciplining it right now. Then there were the prayers. At first, I didn't join in, I just watched. But the more I saw it, the more I understood that this wasn't just ritual for the sake of ritual. It was like hitting the reset button 5 times a day. You could be stressed, distracted, pulled in a million directions, and then, boom, the call to prayer comes, and you stop. You face one direction, you bow, you acknowledge. I started wondering what my life would look like if I actually built my day around that rhythm instead of squeezing it in between everything else. That was a dangerous thought, because once you start picturing it, you can't picture it, and here's something else. I noticed how those prayers created community. I'd be at a gym or a studio or even in an airport, and Muslims who didn't even know each other would just line up together. No small talk, no awkward introductions, just unity. It didn't matter what language they spoke, what country they came from, how much money they had, they moved as one. Coming from the world of MMA, where unity is often temporary and built on winning. That was a powerful thing to see. This wasn't unity for profit, it was unity for God, but the more I thought about joining in, the more I felt the weight of what that would mean. Islam isn't something you dip your toes into, it's not a spiritual add-on to the life you already have. It changes everything. It reorders your priorities from the ground up, and if I was going to go there, I knew I couldn't just be half in. And that's where the clock started ticking louder in my head. See, when you start looking at life through the lens of death, and I mean really looking, you realize how much time you waste. The hours you'll never get back, the conversations that go nowhere, the grudges you keep like trophies. You start to see them for what they are, dead weight you'll have to answer for. I started cutting things out. Certain shows I used to binge, certain conversations I used to entertain, certain habits that didn't serve me. It wasn't because I thought I was suddenly better than anyone else. It was because I couldn't ignore that quiet truth anymore. One day you'll take your last breath, and none of this will matter except what's on the record. And let me tell you, living like the clock is ticking changes you, not in a panicked do everything before you die way, but in a focused, purposeful way. You start asking yourself, if I died tonight, would I be proud of this day? Some days the answer was yes. Other days not so much, but even those not so much days became lessons. It was around this time that I had my first real brush with the idea of tawbah, repentance. In Islam, repentance isn't this drawn-out process where you punish yourself to prove you're sorry. It's immediate. You realize you messed up, you turn back to God, and you make a conscious decision to do better. That simplicity struck me. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about always course, correcting before the clock runs out. And deep down, I started to feel something I hadn't expected, a kind of peace. Not the everything's fine peace, but the peace that comes from finally admitting you're not the one steering the whole ship. I didn't have to have all the answers. I didn't have to control every outcome. I just had to live like I'd be accountable for it all. The thing about peace is, once you taste it, the chaos you used to live in becomes unbearable. And I didn't realize until then just how much chaos I'd been carrying around. For years, my identity had been built like armor: comedian, podcaster, fighter, hunter, guy who can talk to anyone about anything. It was a suit that fit well, and I wore it proudly. But here's the danger with armor: it doesn't just keep the world out, it keeps certain truths from getting in. And Islam, with all its blunt, no-nonsense reminders about who you are, who God is, and where you're headed, started cracking that armor wide open. At first, it felt like losing part of myself. I'd catch myself hesitating before saying something I normally would on the podcast. I'd pull back from certain jokes that, were funny, but they didn't sit right anymore. I stopped pushing certain topics just for the sake of controversy. It wasn't that I was censoring myself to please anyone. It was that my internal compass was starting to override my old reflexes. But here's where it got really uncomfortable. I started seeing the holes in my old philosophy. I'd always been about live and let live. You do your thing, I'll do mine. And that works on a surface level, but Islam kept poking at the deeper layer. If you see someone walking toward a cliff, do you just let them go because you don't want to interfere? Or do you care enough to warn them, even if they hate you for it? That one hit hard. Because for years I'd been in conversations about life, meaning, and the universe without ever really committing to a position. I was the guy in the middle, exploring all angles, keeping it open-ended, but Islam doesn't really let you do that. It's not a philosophy buffet where you pick your favorite parts. It's all in or all out, and the more I learned, the more I felt the weight of that choice. It forced me to ask, what am I willing to stand for, and what am I willing to give up for it? That's when I started confronting some of my old habits head on. Drinking, that was a big one. I wasn't a constant drinker, but it had been woven into my social fabric for years. The idea of just cutting it out, that was foreign. But when I read why Islam prohibits it, not just because God said so, but because of the way it clouds judgment, breaks discipline, and opens the door to 100 other mistakes, it made sense. Same with ego. I'd always thought I had mine in check, but Islam doesn't just ask you to manage your ego, it asks you to kill it. To submit, that's a word we're allergic to in the West. Submission sounds like weakness, but in this context it wasn't weakness at all. It was strength, the strength to kneel when your pride wants to stand tall. The real turning point came during a hunting trip. I was deep in the woods, no cell signal, just me and the sound of the wind through the trees. I'd taken hundreds of shots before. Bow, rifle, didn't matter, but this time was different. I had this intense, almost uncomfortable awareness that the life I was about to take was being taken with God watching. Not just in the poetic nature is beautiful way, but in the literal you will answer for this way. That moment hit me hard. It wasn't guilt, it was responsibility. Responsibility for how I lived, what I consumed, what I took from the world. And when you really feel that responsibility, you start to realize that nothing, not even a private moment in the woods, is truly private. That awareness started bleeding into everything: how I spent money, how I spoke to strangers, how I treated people who couldn't do anything for me. It's like Islam had given me a new lens, and now I couldn't take it off. And here's the thing about a new lens: it shows you beauty you never noticed before. But it also shows you ugliness you used to ignore. That was the uncomfortable part. I started noticing hypocrisy in others, sure, but especially in myself. Moments where I said one thing but lived another. Times I claimed to value discipline but let comfort win. Times I claimed to respect life but acted carelessly. The old me would have shrugged and said, "Well, nobody's perfect," but Islam doesn't let you hide behind that. It acknowledges you're imperfect, but it demands you keep striving anyway. That was the game changer. And the more I leaned into it, the more the old mold, the one I'd built my entire public identity around, started to crack. Some people didn't notice, others did and thought I was going soft. But I knew it wasn't softness. It was focus, it was clarity. That question, "Am I ready to stand before God with no excuses?" is not the kind of thing you can just set aside for later. Once it's there, it's like a weight pressing on your chest every morning when you wake up. And not in a depressing way, in a way that keeps you honest. I used to think the scariest thing in life was failure, missing an opportunity, losing a fight, saying something stupid on a podcast and getting roasted for it online. That stuff feels big when you're in it, but when you start looking at life through the lens of accountability before God, you realize none of that even comes close. The real fear, the only one that actually matters, is standing there on that day, with every moment of your life laid bare, and realizing you wasted it. That you knew the truth when it was shown to you and still turned away. That you lived like this world was the whole game when it was just the war. Mup. That's the part of Islam that hit me the hardest. It's not about fear for fear's sake. It's about responsibility. It's about the unshakable reality that you will be asked, "What did you do with the time I gave you? With the health I gave you? With the mind and influence I gave you?" And there's no PR spin, no quick joke, no clever deflection that's going to work in that moment. I started picturing it. Not in some abstract, symbolic way, but literally me, standing alone, no audience, no crew, no friends, no distractions. Just me and the one who knows every thought I've ever had, every word I've ever spoken, every choice I've ever made. The idea is so raw, so absolute, it strips you down to the bone, and here's the wild part. It didn't just scare me. It inspired me, because if that's real, if this life is just a blink before eternity, then every breath becomes an opportunity. Every moment is a chance to stack the deck in your favor for that meeting. It changes how you see success. It changes how you see pain. It changes how you see other people. I started realizing that death isn't the enemy. The real enemy is dying unprepared. And the more I thought about that, the more I understood why Muslims pray the way they do, live the way they do, fast the way they do. It's not about ritual for ritual's sake. It's training. It's building muscle memory for the soul. So when the time comes to leave this life, you're not caught off guard. That's when the circle closed for me. I thought back to that first time I saw those guys praying after training, the sweat still on their faces, the world still moving around them, and yet they had the discipline to stop, to bow, to submit. I realized I wasn't just inspired by their commitment. I was looking at people who had already answered the question I was now asking myself. Am I ready to stand before God with no excuses? For them, the answer was yes, or at least, they were living every day as if they were trying to make it yes. And that's what shifted everything for me, because I knew I couldn't go back to pretending the question didn't exist. The journey didn't end with some dramatic conversion moment or a lightning bolt from the sky. It wasn't about flipping a switch and becoming perfect overnight. It was about a decision. The decision to start living like the meeting was inevitable because it is. And when you start living that way, everything else changes. The noise quiets, the chaos fades. The old armor you thought you needed starts to fall away. You stop chasing the approval of people who won't matter in the end, and you start preparing for the one who will. That's the gift Islam gave me, not just a new perspective on life, but a completely different relationship with death. It's no longer the finish line I was trying not to think about. It's the meeting I'm trying to be ready for. And when you live like that, you're free. Not free to do whatever you want, but free from the fear that the end is just nothing. Free from the illusion that this is all there is. Free from the pressure to be your own God, because the truth is, you already have one. And he's been watching the whole time. So the real question isn't whether you believe in him. The real question, the only question that will matter when that last breath comes, is whether you're ready to meet him. And for the first time in my life, I can honestly say I'm trying to be.